Rather like the titular character, Tim Burton seems to have risen from the grave with the release of Beetlejuice last month. It's a great film. I loved it, you loved it, and it has critics and fans of Burton hailing it as his return to form. So after seeing it in the cinema a few weeks ago, it got me thinking about why it seems like it's been so long since we've had a film from Tim Burton that really felt like Tim Burton. What makes him so good when he's good and so bad when he's bad? And analysing this has been no small feat because Burton has made a lot of movies, even more than you might initially think. To make sure that we have the same info and there's full unmissable context, I'm going to throw up a graphic of all his films in order here. And depending on who you talk to, his quote-unquote downfall may be marked by Charlie, Sweeney, or Alice. With so many films, I won't be able to cover them all in detail, lest we be glued to our computers till 2025. But I'm really trying not to overlook the vastness and diversity of his portfolio. And obviously I don't mean diversity in a cultural sense, because we all know that's something that you are not going to see in a Tim Burton film. Alice to Dumbo is probably his most heavily criticised period of consecutive filmmaking. But opposing the common narrative around Burton's work, I'm not trying to draw a line chronologically and say he was good up until this point and flopped Tina Aguilera ever since. Rather, I want to explore the good and the bad and what they do or don't have in common. And to do this, I have placed the films into 10 perfect, immutable, inarguable categories that I'm sure no one will have any issues with. Practical effects versus CGI, small stories versus big stories, art versus not art, vibrant versus lifeless, and risks versus safe. Also, just before we truly get stuck in, if you're new here, I'm Girl on Film and I talk about cinema that centres around horror, fashion, and femininity, and I am very stoked to have you here today. Also, don't be alarmed that I have some very elegant sores on my face. I know they're there. I am all good. And in the words of Ekaterina Petrovna Zamolodchikova, it's a rash, not a herpes sore. From the beginning of his career, Burton has heavily utilised practical effects. As an aspiring filmmaker on a $0 budget in the 70s, he didn't really have a choice. And after being picked up to work as a concept artist and animator at Walt Disney Studios of all places, he was given the opportunity to make his first notable short film with Vincent in 1982. To create Vincent, he and art director Rick Heinrich used a practical effect that Burton has returned to time and time again: stop motion. Stop motion is sadly not super lucrative, but it's a beloved art form. There's something magical in seeing art pieces come to life, like you used to dream of your toys doing in your sleep. Stop motion worlds are uncanny and enchanting all at once, as real as you or I, but impossible to observe in real time. As Burton says himself, I started to do stop motion when I was a kid. I loved all forms of animation, but there is something unique and special to stop motion. It's more real and the set is lit like a set. But I think it's also a kind of lonely and dark thing to want to do. God, he's so artistic and sensitive. The Corpse Bride and Frankenweenie are actually his only full-length films to be produced in stop motion. As some of you will probably know, Tim Burton did not direct The Nightmare Before Christmas, but we'll get to that further down the line in this video. He's also incorporated stop motion as a practical effect in many of his other films, like Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Beetlejuice, and Beetlejuice, and presumably in the future, Beetlejuice. Stop motion aside, his early work is filled with beautiful puppetry, miniatures, sets, painted backdrops, wacky props, and prosthetics. I won't bore you with the details because it's more interesting just to look. There's Batman, which utilizes almost all of these elements, and it looks fucking awesome, putting modern superhero movies to shame. Beetlejuice is obviously a big one here, with amazing surreal sets and its iconic miniature model town. In Edward Scissorhands, they painted all the houses in a real suburb, sickly pastels, so that they could film on location. Ed Wood, a film that didn't really require any special effects based on its biographical story, goes out of its way to create an opening credit sequence sequence with a gorgeous 3D graveyard set featuring the actors' names on the headstones and a stop-motion tentacle to set the tone. These films feel so rich and real and tactile, and to me, there's this cabinet of Dr. Caligari lost inside a pop-up book quality. I love the conflicting atmosphere that a practical set and practical effects create. A world that feels so real and one you know psychologically has existed for a moment in time, but it's also something that often lacks realism and feels decidedly otherworldly. Even for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which does use CGI throughout, Burton made sure as to build as many practical elements as possible, including full-scale 360-degree enclosed sets, a chocolate river filled with 927,410 litres of an edible fluid, and 54 animatronic Oompa Loompas that man the candy boat. And the inclusion of practical special effects in the over-the-top, overstimulating world of Wonka really highlights how poor the choice was to use majority computer-generated imagery in 2010's Alice in Wonderland. There are plenty of archival reviews praising the dazzling Underland and its darker than usual Disney design choices. And I'm not gonna lie, I thought this film looked freaking awesome when I was a 14-year-old. This was a time when we were swept up in the world of CGI as it continued to make hefty developments, and films like Avatar, which came out the year prior, first exposed us to never before seen levels of detail and realism. I just noticed this has been undone the entire time and it's going to drive me insane. Don't mention it. Do not mention it. But Alice, in all its attempts to be a spectacular, feels like an animation studio exploded and everything everyone was working on was molded together in some giant hulking digital monstrosity. Because every scene and set piece is so elaborate and colourful and crazy looking, nothing stands out. It's so overwhelming that it's ultimately underwhelming. It's just mush. It's like the inside of your kitchen bin at the end of the week. Sure, there's a lot going on, but I can't really tell you what's from what, and I certainly don't want to look at it for too long. While the CGI in Alice is impressive, the over-the-top style prevents it from ever feeling real, and therefore it's painfully obvious that Mia Wasikowska is traipsing from green screen to green screen, talking to tennis balls. Watching it now, I mostly feel disappointed because it was such a wasted opportunity to make something on a big budget with lasting impact. When I imagine what a Wonderland that utilizes the effects of Burton's other films looks like, I see something far more eerie, bizarre, and otherworldly, and actually more in line with the imagery of Disney's own original adaptation, but for big kids. CGI is not inherently bad at all. It's an incredible technical art that should be valued, but it should also be applied with caution. And Alice is a great example of caution being thrown to the wind. While I'm sure the final designs rendered by animators were something many people worked on painstakingly, it sounds as if Burton wasn't even sure of the aesthetic endgame while they were filming. According to The Guardian, Burton said of Alice, "We didn't know what the movie was till the very end. It was exciting and scary. Working on the CG just got more and more and more intense. Curiouser and curiouser." Burton criticized CGI in an interview with longtime collaborator Danny Elfman for Interview magazine. Discussing the monster films of yesteryear, Burton said, "I find that a lot of monsters today are just so busy. They have so many little tentacles and flaps and whatever else that they don't have the kind of strength in their images that the old monsters had. It's also due to the CGI heaviness. You're missing the human element, like Boris Karloff, who actually played the monsters." The quote is especially disappointing on reflection given the choices made in Netflix's Wednesday series, where one of the series' antagonists is a humanoid monster. While the design is clearly Burtonian, the final product rendered digitally lacks its essence. And you know what, actually, I have to say it, Mars Attacks. Mars Attacks, though it may be a beloved cult classic, looks like shit. Clearly the possibilities of 1996 CGI got to everyone's heads because this was the perfect opportunity for some classic practical puppetry, and instead we got this. I hate this movie. From the limited impression I could get of Burton's own perspective, it doesn't seem like he particularly enjoys working with CGI or enjoys the results. But it hasn't stopped him from taking on projects like Alice, Miss Peregrine's and Dumbo that lean so heavily on it. And a dodgy elephant or CGI skeleton here or there are only the beginning of Burton's troubles. It's no secret that Tim Burton struggles with big stories. If you're around my age, the films that spring to mind when you think of Burton's triumphs, Corpse Bride, Sleepy Hollow, Edward Scissorhands, are relatively simple and small-scale tales. A defined world, a small town or village, a shy or humble main character, a love story and a triumph of good. These stories are fables and fairy tales repackaged through a Burtonian lens. And very important to note before we go ahead, Burton isn't the writer of the majority of his films, having only been a story creator for Scissorhands and Frankenweenie and an uncredited screenwriter on Mars Attacks. So I'm not necessarily critiquing the screenwriting, but more so observing the kinds of stories Burton succeeds and fails at bringing to life on screen. The fridge is buzzing. Big Fish does a beautiful job at telling a small story. While it is a strange story and one made up of flashbacks, it's still effectively one man on a linear journey. And significantly, its emotional core is simple and deep-rooted. Big Fish is about losing a father, and even though Burton didn't write it, it's a deeply personal story, which he came to direct after the death of his own father, with whom he had a complicated relationship. Burton said of the script, "This puts an image to the uncommunicable. It hit me on a level." And Burton is able to inject so much of his signature wackiness and whimsy into Big Fish because this emotional story is uncrowded. And through it all, his own relationship to the story is felt by the viewer because it's real, whether Edward Bloom's tall tales are or not. Similarly, Ed Wood's straightforward plot allows its genuine substance to shine. Ed Wood, the film, doesn't stretch itself to be a bigger exploration of the film industry or the troubles of the period. There's nothing of epic proportions in this film, no twists or turns or hooks, or attempts to draw multiple stories together. And similarly to Big Fish, while the world feels fleshed out, it's still very much one person's story. As it goes, I've noticed that Ed Wood is rarely discussed in Burton-related content, and I actually, somewhat shamefully, had never even heard of it before doing the research for this video. I was really shocked to find out that it's one of his most critically applauded films, and it earned Martin Landau a Best Supporting Actor Oscar. If, like me, you hadn't come across it until now, I would highly encourage you to seek it out. It's one of his best films ever and one of notable substance. It's the small stories that most successfully package real emotions. And this works for Burton specifically as there is room to explore a small idea with exciting, unusual visual language without it feeling overstuffed. On the flip side, many of Burton's attempts to go big with epic tales, winding narratives, and larger casts fall short. Planet of the Apes and Mars Attacks are early examples during his supposed golden years of his struggle with telling big-scale stories. Apes was a box office hit, but is generally agreed to be a pretty rubbish film that dumbs down and arbitrarily remixes the original. Mars Attacks, which was received poorly by critics and barely broke even, may have its ardent supporters, but its simultaneous attempt at parody and homage and multiple storylines leave little room for it to have any emotional impact. Batman is maybe the only time the handling of a big story was done well. Fans still weren't fond of the changes Burton made to the comic book lore and his lack of attention to the characterization of Batman himself, but his dark tone won people over and the film was a hit. Batman Returns, while also being a box office success and being praised for taking his unique style even further, seems to struggle even more with telling its epic story. Owen Gleiberman for Entertainment Weekly said of Batman Returns, "Batman Returns has too many competing characters, too many sets, every scene seems to unfold on a different surreal soundstage, too many ideas that don't go anywhere. Similarly, Janet Maslin said in the New York Times, "The blandness of Batman, through no fault of Mr. Keaton, who plays the character with appropriate earnestness, is symptomatic of this material's main shortcoming. Almost nothing about it makes sense or particularly matters." And to turn to Burton's supposed flop era, it is Alice in Wonderland. Once again, that exemplifies his weak spots. The film is considered to have begun the Disney remake trend that has become ever more draining. And I can only assume that in order to justify its existence, the studio felt like they needed to do more than just a copy and paste of the cartoon into flesh and blood, a strategy that they've clearly since given up on. In Alice, Burton and Disney take their own simple retelling of Lewis Carroll's original book and try to create an epic out of it, rendering it a bloated and incongruous sequel. Burton was already experimenting with expanding simple fables into epic adventures with Sleepy Hollow and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by adding character backstories and excessive flashbacks. But to me, it isn't as egregious in those examples, as the fable structure of each story remained pretty clear and consistent with the source material. I know that's debatable in Tim Burton fan spaces, among Burton heads, if you will, but that is my feeling on it. However, by expanding the story of Alice in Wonderland, it definitely loses the simple magic of the original story and even of Disney's original film. The director has said himself that he never really got the point of the original story or previous adaptations, saying that previous Alice films were always just a girl wandering. And there's no denying it. They are. But that's also the point. And if it didn't resonate with dear Timothy, maybe he shouldn't have taken on the project. His limited grasp of the story, a child staggering helplessly through the terrors of life, and its themes of loss of innocence, time, and meaninglessness show in the final product of Alice 2010. Disney and Burton tried to make it a bigger story, but the story becomes contradictory. It's about finding your own path, which ends up in the real world with her saying no to a proposal which everyone expects her to accept. And yet, in Underland, she fulfills the prophecy that she'll slay the Jabberwocky, something that she's destined and expected to do. These two stories have no parallel lesson, as she abides in one and not the other, and that feels like a shockingly obvious thematic issue to have remained in the final product. There's also the idea that all the best people are mad, and I like this a lot and wonder if the focus of the dramatic argument was there, they would have a more successful story. I see that playing out as Alice saving herself and others in unexpected, unusual ways that no one else would think of. Overall, Burton's story just sees her being thrown about, or as he might say, being the girl wandering, until she's forced to step up to the plate in a scenario that has no bearings on her own arc. There's also the heightened inclusions of the Hatter and the White Queen from passing oddities to central figures. As you probably know if you remember the release of this film, Depp's Hatter was the final straw for some people in enjoying his working relationship with Burton, as it compressed all the joyful kookiness and earnestness of past performances into one orange-haired, trauma-dumping, breakdancing lunatic. I get that they wanted to give Burton a big role as the most popular actor attached at the time, but my God, was it not necessary to make him so present and so eccentric. Alice was followed by a sequence of films that share its various failings. Stories that have an excess of characters, themes, and plot lines, with too much going on narratively to let Burton's unique strengths shine. Dumbo expanded upon a classic, bringing in human leads and a critique of modern capitalism. Dark Shadows attempts an intergenerational family affair in which no one feels fully fleshed out or, frankly, relevant. Wednesday was beloved by many, mostly because it gave us 10 hours of the deadpan charisma magnet that is Jenna Ortega, but let's not act like it was a great piece of storytelling. I was bored out of my mind throughout most of this series and rolling my eyes at predictable twists the rest of the time. The Addams Family movies, notably not directed by Burton, are so fun and you feel attached to every family member. But Wednesday failed to create anything more engaging than a poorly developed love triangle fanfiction akin to what you may have written as a 16-year-old, right? Guys, this is one of my saddest personal secrets.
I have a book of handwritten Harry Styles fan fiction that I wrote when I was about 17. 2016's Miss Peregrine's Home for Unusual Children is an adaptation of the young adult book series of the same name. Despite making a decent amount of changes to the source material, Burton and writer Jane Goodman were unable to successfully translate it to screen, with the storytelling drawing criticism from reviewers and book fans. Writing for Roger Ebert, Christy Lemire described Peregrines as a convoluted slog dense in mythology and explanatory dialogue but woefully lacking in thrills. Even The Guardian's incredibly positive review of the film concedes that the plot is extremely predictable and the third act's action set pieces seem to go on forever. Epics just aren't Burton's thing, even when someone else has done the hard yards of creating the story for him, and especially in cases where he tries to expand on existing worlds and lore. 2012's Frankenweenie, which was released amidst these various attempts to tell more large-scale stories, proves more than anything that Burton still has the goods. He just needs to stick to the small-scale fables and personal, emotionally linear tales he's best at. Even the celebrated Beetlejuice struggles to tell a broader story that weaves multiple threads in plot alone. Characters dip in and out, and plot lines are wrapped up as soon as they begin or basically forgotten. Monica Lewinsky. And within this, the beats of a mother and daughter's acceptance of each other feels so surface level. But nonetheless, I was still absolutely overjoyed watching Beetlejuice, with credit to one super distinct element of Burton's work: his style, not just as a filmmaker, but as an artist. Which brings us to... Burton is, first and forever, a visual artist. As previously mentioned, he actually began his career working as a concept artist and animator at Disney. He wasn't so hot at drawing floppy-eared furry friends, but it was during this time that his unique concept art caught the attention of the bigwigs. No one could deny that he had the talent and an eccentric personal style. The vividly memorable world of The Nightmare Before Christmas began as a poem and a set of sketches that Tim Burton created at Disney during this time. A brief history of this confusing production: the studio decided they wanted to take a gamble on it, but with Burton now working on other projects elsewhere, it was offered to talented upcoming animator Henry Selick. Some of you probably know this already, but the reason that people often think that Tim Burton is the one that directed it is because Disney advertised it as Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas after Batman had become such a massive success. Basically, they wanted to capitalize on his name, and because of this, poor Selick, whose other brilliant films include James the Giant Peach and Coraline, was somewhat sidelined. But in terms of what makes the film what it is, while Selick is an incredible animator and director, much of the distinctive style of the film comes from Burton's sketches. There is a very direct translation from the original images he drew in his 20s to the 3D models of the film, and the end result is beautiful, whimsical, creepy, and instantly recognizable. As his sketches were the basis, the same style of character and world design with wide-eyed faces, spindly limbs, and complex line work remained a prominent feature in the other stop-motion films that he directed himself. And beyond his concept sketches, I also want to draw attention to his more general art style. Again, he wasn't just a designer, he was an artist. And as many of you will well know, artists draw a bunch of shit for fun all the time, pouring out from brain to page. I think something that makes his films feel really special is that he's used his artworks and signature imagery, some of which he probably drew long before he knew he'd ever get to direct his own films, to make up or add to sets and costumes. The way the stitches on Catwoman's costume look like drawn stitches from an illustration, like the ones on Sally, or the appearances of the black and white striped sandworm, his spiraled branches and exaggerated cartoonish shadows. I want to clearly distinguish between his general style as a filmmaker and his actual art in this section, so I hope that's coming across. Did somebody mention art? The style is vivid, expressionistic, distorted, but also simplistic and childlike. Basic patterns, warped shapes, bold colours. The influence of German Expressionism is super clear. Right from Vincent, you can see how films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu have influenced him. There are also echoes of Dr. Seuss, with all the stripes and swirls and contrast between vivid black and vivid colour. This use of art in his films creates a very specific pop-up book quality, with 3D and 2D sets and props that really retain that illustrative 2D feeling. One of the most interesting projects of his that fully embraces his art is his long-forgotten Disney Channel movie Hansel and Gretel, made in 1983. Sadly, the Disney Channel swiftly buried it as it aired to a probably very confused audience of children. I'm sure it made a lot of children cry, and probably a lot of adults. The project is, without pulling punches, baffling, but it's also so beautiful. It is a retelling of Hansel and Gretel with an all-Japanese cast that's clearly inspired by the likes of Haisu and supposedly Godzilla. The German Expressionism is there too, the horror imagery is there, the Seussian elements are there. While it looks fairly cheap and flat at moments like a bad school play, it's enchanting for just how wacky and committed it is, and a perfect example of Burton's 2D art being erected and brought to life. Of his live actions, this style is very present in Beetlejuice, and we see glimpses in Pee-wee's Adventure, Mars Attacks, Batman, and Sleepy Hollow. And don't get me wrong, there are films where his art style isn't present at all, like Ed Wood and Big Fish. Remember, we're talking his art and not just his style. And those films still work and feel like Burton, even if it's less obvious fringe Burton in some cases. But I think there is no film of his that does utilize his art that doesn't work. It just instantly creates a beautiful, surreal world that you want to step into. And as far as I'm concerned, it's one of the elements that makes a Burton film more likely to be a goodie. Aside from his unique art style, one of Burton's greatest strengths is his unique tone. Built upon references of old, his love of hammer horror, gothics, schlock, and spoof. He often focuses on dark worlds and undead characters, but within this he manages to pack a twisted, humorous, energetic, and even a heartfelt punch. He manages to make the morbid and melancholy feel vibrant and full of life. I would credit this vibrant tone to two aspects of his filmmaking, the aesthetic and the atmosphere. If we look at just the visual side and keeping in mind everything we've discussed already, we know that Tim Burton is so much more than just grayscale films with spooky imagery. Edward Scissorhands is iconically Burtonian, and while its pastel world is something we don't instinctively associate with him, it's a huge and recurrent part of his style, and it really serves the film. Edward stands out so much more against this backdrop than he would otherwise. Ed Wood is completely black and white, but the blacks are so deep and the whites pop, so every frame feels strikingly cinematic. The underworlds of Beetlejuice and Corpse Bride are inversely colourful, vivid purples, neon oranges, and sickly greens. All these elements combine to make worlds that look far more lively, memorable, and often haunting than if they simply were turning down the saturation. And then there's atmosphere. At their best, his worlds aren't just pretty to look at, but packed with humour and satire, and everyone on screen is giving their all. Burton is camp. Batman Returns, Beetlejuice, Pee-wee, Sleepy Hollow, Mars Attacks, these films are mad. Sometimes it's completely overt, and sometimes it's a few subtle jokes or a shocking moment. Like when the big reveal happens in Corpse Bride. That is melodrama. At his best, Burton's aesthetic and atmospheric elements come together to make dark things, morbid things, sad things, exciting, beautiful, fun, and emotionally engaging. Yet, at his worst, his films are dead in their own way, cold and limp and lifeless. This might be controversial, but I see Sweeney Todd as one of Burton's weakest films. And in my mind, it's the film that most distinctly marks the changeover into a different Burton, if we can even say there is one. I didn't think this when the film first came out. I was actually really struck by it. After the first time I watched it, I actually hid the DVD box because I was like so afraid of the sinister aura that it had, that it may reach me throughout my day. But over time, I have realized how much it fails at creating the same magic as its source material, to the point where I don't see the magic in it at all. Compare the humor and energy of the stage musical with the flat performances, weak voices, and altered script of the film. Brace yourselves for a mini Sweeney Todd deep dive, because I feel very strongly about this one. The powerhouse actors at the helm give us nothing, and I think part of this was purely down to miscasting. Neither of them can sing, which changes all the song delivery, and the weak delivery seems to have been followed through by smaller and less dynamic characterization. Toby is supposed to be a spirited but deeply troubled child, and here he's just a little boy. Joanna has a lot more autonomy and a fairly believable love story, but here she barely even speaks and spends most of the film being gazed upon. Alan Rickman still breathes so much life into Judge Turpin because he's Alan Rickman, but they remove his flagellation scene that shows Turpin's inner turmoil and sexual torment. I can't help but feel all of the characters have had the life sucked out of them until they become the same wide-eyed, pale-faced Burton caricature. Oh, the fridge. Pirelli is the only character who really gets to play with humor, but it just feels like Sacha Baron Cohen being Sacha Baron Cohen, and it's not even that funny. When I saw this live, I was literally screaming in the front middle seat. The guy playing Pirelli chose to go for more of a Trixie Mattelda Sweden accent, and it destroyed me. Du scheibe the face, du gata the hair, du scheibe the face, du gata the hair. When it comes to humour in general in stage versions of Sweeney Todd, of course every production will make its own changes, with some leaning into more overt comedy than others, and some leaning very far away from it. But it's always going to be a dark comedy to some degree in its bare bones. With songs like Worst Pies in London, Pirelli's Miracle Elixir, and A Little Priest being packed with comedic lines. But Burton's version barely reads as comedic when the songs are delivered with monotone vocals and thousand-mile stares. I think he relied heavily on the story and lyrics doing the work. But without the right delivery, the tone is just cold and dreary. And the issue here is not that it's a miserable film. Batman is mean and nasty, but it's gleefully nasty. And this is a sense you get much more so with Sweeney on stage. I think Burton's attachment to Depp and Helena Bonham Carter clouded his vision for the film from the beginning, which caused a knock-on effect of toning it down from a dark comedy to a Victorian sob story, aiming for a sense of realism over melodrama. Even the way it looks doesn't quite work for me. It's an almost black and white world with splashes of uber-saturated blood, but it's really lacking in depth, and the ruby red blood is too close to ketchup to feel sinister. I can understand the choice to use such a bright colour is to show that it is the one bright spot in Sweeney's world, giving both him and us a rush of excitement upon its release. But it also leaves every frame without it feeling incredibly dull, in my opinion. Oh my god, and I didn't mention this in the CGI section, but there's some fugly-ass CGI in this film. It's obviously supposed to look a bit 2D, I think. I think probably in reference to its stage roots with 2D set pieces, like literally painted cardboard, but rendered in CGI, it just doesn't work. It looks awful. Like you did a stage play. Okay, I'm not gonna keep talking about Sweeney Todd. When Burton deals purely in bleakness, without humour, hunger, or visual delights, the worlds and characters are reduced to blank grey slates.
Unfortunately for Burton, these failings are especially obvious in Sweeney Todd because we have the stage version to compare it to. But I feel this flatness and lifelessness is present in many of the films that followed. Dark Shadows has surface-level Burtonness, but it feels like a watered-down version of his work. Like someone told an AI to make a Tim Burton film that just couldn't recapture the magic. Miss Peregrine's also has Burton oddness in concept, but is generic in its execution. Big Eyes, one of his lesser successes, though it's a solid film, is aesthetically most like Big Fish, but tonally reads as a very standard biopic, without his usual wickedness or whimsy pushing through. And credit to Burton, the industry and consumer demand changes. The quirky sensibilities of his films in the 80s and 90s were reflected in the wider indie film scene at the time. Camp, splatter films, absurdist films, this was very much a beloved style of filmmaking. And as time went on, mainstream cinema became more invested in realism, grit, and subtlety. These aren't inherently Burton traits, and as he tried or just ended up adapting, you could say he lost some of his spark. Dumbo, however, is a pretty cut and dry case of bad Burton. Disney has this incredible way of hiring brilliant directors like Nikki Cairo, Kate Shortland, and David Lowery, and flattening their brilliance into the same bland, commercially friendly chum, chowed down by all the teeny tiny mice that secretly run the business from within the Anaheim park. Burton was brought in to make Dumbo 9 years after Alice, before the company had completely solidified the poor reputation of their live-action remakes. But sadly, Burton's Dumbo not only caved to, but in some ways established, the monotonous tone of Disney remakes. The film is desaturated, probably in an attempt to not look like a silly kids film and be taken seriously, but not desaturated intentionally enough to embody his style. It neither succeeds at being a fun children's film or a subversion of the original, which is already pretty dark and not in need of much twisting to make it adult material. It's as heartless as a story about capitalism made by the world's biggest media conglomerate can be, and I'm not really sure what they wanted it to be. It looks and feels like it could be made by anyone, without any of Burton's visual or tonal idiosyncrasies. As a filmmaker who often deals with death and darkness in his work, Burton's filmography proves that darkness feels so much deeper when it's actually rich with colour. Death is more interesting when it's full of life, when he successfully imbues this vibrancy into the aesthetic and atmosphere he makes his best works. It's the final chapter. It's time to talk about something a little more serious. It's actually not. This isn't very serious. Burton has been very blessed when it comes to people taking chances on him. While Disney eventually let him go because they didn't know how to rinse him for money at the time, they did initially take a gamble on him, and he was given the opportunity to make 3 short films with them. After this departure, Warner let him run wild with Pee-wee's Big Adventure. They took a risk on his vision of the Batman, even though the dark and twisted tone was unlike any of the superhero films that had come before it. He worked with Fox on Scissorhands despite it being a totally original story, and quite unlike the Batman film he'd just become famous for. Ed Wood was discarded by Columbia Pictures over Burton's creative choices, but picked up by Disney as Touchstone, and it went on to win Oscars. He's made morbid children's films, an area where that's unusual, i.e. risky, and it's resulted in some of his best work. Mars Attacks exists also. All in all, he's taken and been allowed to take many creative risks, and these risks have been fully embraced by audiences and studios alike. But the bigger you get as a filmmaker, the more pressure there is on you to produce the goods. And the more financial support, exposure, and connections that come with climbing the ladder and working with big studios, the more people also have an input on your final products. Everyone gets a say, from producers to investors to test audiences.
And this point in Burton's career, the point at which he would undoubtedly be considered a successful big-time filmmaker after having made the films I just listed, is when it seems he stopped taking such big risks with his films. And Disney, still not knowing how to get the best of him, signed Burton on to make two of his blandest films, depressingly safe thematically and lacking in Burtonian charms and edge. Why he has continued to work with them is bizarre, especially as he described his time working as an animator with Disney in his early 20s as being like a zombie factory worker. And the relationship is obviously more complicated than just Disney bad. In his own words, "It's like a family. I can look back and recognize the many, many positives of working there and all the opportunities I've had. I can acknowledge each and every one of those very deeply and very positively. Equally, on the other side, I can identify the negative, soul-destroying side." Perhaps he is stuck in a hellish contract with Disney that we aren't aware of. But with the info we have, Burton's choice to work with Disney over and over is more likely grounded in the tasty checks they write him. And that's a pretty disappointing move from an innovator and a risk taker like Burton. Each time he works with them, he signifies to us that he is happy playing it safe. Because he really doesn't need to. Although, it seems like Dumbo may have finally ended his working relationship with Disney for good, given that he said at a 2022 press conference, "The thing about Dumbo is that's why I think my days with Disney are done. I realized that I was Dumbo, that I was working in this horrible big circus and I needed to escape. It's gotten to be very homogenized, very consolidated." The Disney critics aside, I actually think that we, as the consumers of his movies, could also take some of the blame for the supposed downward trajectory of his career. We boxed him in and we criticized him every time he did take a risk in this sense being something that was different for him. We say we want the old Burton back, but in some ways we just want the facade of old Burton, the aesthetic qualities, not the spirit of risk-taking. Otherwise, we would have turned out to see Frankenweenie or Big Eyes. But one significant area, the bane of my life, the fridge, has begun humming. One significant area where Burton has not shown any signs of risk-taking in his work that might contribute to a feeling of dissatisfaction from audiences is with the substance of his films. He brands himself as a weirdo, or has at least expressed that others have always interpreted him this way, and frequently directs films about loners, outcasts, and oddballs. But Burton's outsider identity is really only grounded in being a quiet kid who liked horror movies, hung out in graveyards, and felt emotionally and socially at odds with the world. He was by no means an outcast in anything more than a playground sense. And certainly within the industry, he was someone that people were intrigued by, wanted to work with, and swiftly embraced. His brand of outcast has resulted in thematically simple films. They're not challenging anything or fighting grander misconceptions. Rather, he meditates on being a bit of a weirdo over and over. I feel that the most major risk Burton has taken regarding the actual content of his films is with the aforementioned Ed Wood. Ed Wood touches sympathetically on Wood's transvestitism. And if you have any confusion about what that means, that's not an insult or a slur. Vestments is literally, it's either Latin or French for like garment. And it simply means you enjoy wearing the sort of assigned clothing of another gender, but it does not mean that you are transgender. Burton put so much emotion and sympathy into this cross-dressing story, and it actually does something important for other people who felt like Ed. It showed he was human and wonderful and worthy of acceptance. This story had a real edge of anarchy, and I wonder if a lack of more complex and challenging ideas is one of the reasons it feels like his filmmaking has run out of steam a bit. Perhaps people are tiring of seeing him tell the same tale of a fictional outsider, especially when he completely ignores the existence of, actual Black people, particularly in his filmography. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I would be remiss not to mention it. All I will say on it is this. If Beetlejuice 2's Party City Soul Train was a conscious attempt from Burton to make up for this, it did not.
Hey guys, it's me from editing. I don't want to make light of this situation too much, as Burton has made some very questionable comments on race, and I decided it actually is very much something that needs addressing in this video. These comments are racist, and his unwillingness to learn is an issue. Burton has been widely criticized for his limited inclusion of people of color in his films in the past, and it's not like Burton has no people of color, particularly black people, in his films. I don't want to skew the truth, so I will link out to a DeviantArt post that someone has put together, which is an image and a full list of people of color in Burton's films. This list was actually intended to be a defense of Burton, which I don't think it is successful at all. I will let you make up your own mind, so please go and look at it. But in my opinion, given that it's summarizing over 20 projects, it's very disappointing. You only need to watch a few of his films yourself to see the distinct lack of POC cast members, especially in notable roles. And while he may have cast the likes of Samuel L. Jackson in Miss Peregrine's, this doesn't make up for his apparent inability to see black people particularly as normal members of society who could play any role in his movies. More to the point, it's Burton's comments that really reveal where he stands. Burton saying he didn't need to see white people in blaxploitation films shows a gross misunderstanding of race on a whole and the realities of oppressed minorities, of which black people historically and unquestionably are. Saying that including black and Asian children in the Brady Bunch was political correctness shows that he views them as abnormalities rather than normal children. No one is perfect and racism is nuanced, but his responses show someone with no interest in listening, and frankly someone in denial of the oppression that racial minorities experience and have experienced. Beetlejuice's Soul Train bit and its joke about a little Asian girl's last name shows us that he still doesn't see black and Asian people as like everyone else, but as stereotypes at best, utilized for a pun or a punching bag. As much as I've been writing for his films from a creative perspective in this video, I think this notion that his films don't call for diversity is abhorrent. And one final clarification so that this isn't misconstrued entirely: neither Burton nor anyone else needs to face adversity to make art of value. The point here is not that he has nothing to say or nothing valuable to contribute, but that he seems to believe that people of color have no place in his fantasy worlds.
Burton can and should celebrate just being a skinny, pale-faced weird kid who loves death, but he could definitely develop on his own loner ideology a heck of a lot more and dive deeper into and draw more out of it to make some more interesting films and show he's evolved from Vincent.
At bare minimum, Burton could cast more people of color in the stories he already tells, and not for the sake of a punchline or as an occasional extra, because the stories he tells have nothing to do with race, and therefore there is no need to use race to tell the story. In theory, every person should be on an equal plane in the kinds of worlds that he creates.
And to take it even further, he could, in his position, choose to highlight and explore the outsider status of other people, experiencing more damning and even genuinely harmful opposition, as he once did with Ed Wood. Without that, while still being a creative marvel, he's undoubtedly a safe filmmaker. The kind that a studio can employ without any concerns that he'll ever say anything actually controversial or challenging in his films, because he doesn't want to. He has become rather a metaphorical grandfather in the industry, full of his own value, wisdom, and insight, but not particularly interested in seeing how other people can offer those same things too.
touched on this in the introduction, but working on this video has really highlighted to me that Burton hasn't been in the major career flop that people say he has. Big Eyes and Frankenweenie were well received, but sadly rather forgotten movies that were made in the midst of his 4 worst. And even then, Alice was a box office giant, and Miss Peregrine's response was mixed, with a fairly positive audience reception rather than downright negative. Depending on how you feel about his films, you could argue that really 1994's Ed Wood was the last film in his sequence of clear successes, with Mars Attacks, which did pretty poorly at the time, beginning the next 2 decades of ups and downs. Pointedly, I think we can forget the narrative that Burton hasn't made anything good in over a decade. He's experimented beyond the bounds of his distinctive style and with the scale of stories he tells, and he has somewhat sold out to Disney on more than one occasion for those big D checks. But the heart of Burton isn't lost, and when looking at his overarching career, it never really was. He has hits and he has misses, and in this analysis, I certainly feel like I've figured out for myself what puts one of his films in either of those categories. He's become so defined by definitions even more arbitrary than my own that sometimes his good work is discarded on the basis that it's not Burton enough. It's not what we want from him. Beetlejuice's return has somewhat proven this and exemplified what we've always known. His films don't have the best stories or emotional arcs or satisfying in-world logic, and they don't need to. But if we feel that sense of creativity and uniqueness that a 20-something-year-old Burton first brought to the table in the 80s, then we can overlook their faults. Without these Burtonisms, however, his films may either straight up fail or simply be forgotten to time. When Tim Burton embraces practical effects, small stories, his own art, a vibrant tone, and the kind of creative risks that made him initially stand out, he makes masterpieces. And I see no reason that he, or any other sprightly, wide-eyed filmmaker with a penchant for the morbid, absurd, or melancholic, can't open a door to a world like this again.